He was to make the fat of the sin offering go up in smoke on the altar. The scapegoat was to be led out into the wilderness by the priest-elected man. The man who took the goat out to the desert was to return to the camp, wash his clothes, and immerse in a mikveh. He then would return to his tent or house. To recap, the high priest was over the priest. The blood of all sacrifices, regardless of whether it was bovine, ovine, caprine, or avian, was to be splashed on all four sides of the altar by only the Levitical priesthood. If someone slaughtered an ox, lamb, or goat outside the camp and did not bring the blood to the priest, that person was to be excommunicated. Leviticus 16:25 through 17:7. Even though their ancestors came up from Egypt, they were no different from the Philistines, who were from Kephator or Aram, who came from Ker. For its sins, Adonai would completely eradicate the kingdom of Samaria, shaking it and dispersing them among all the Gentiles as grains are strained through a sieve. This was done to purify the sinners who thought they would escape judgment. The time would come when the fallen tabernacle of David would be raised up and restored. The land would be bountiful and the fortunes replenished. The cities would be rebuilt and gardens and vineyards planted. Once it was restored, what would be left of the Gentile nations and Edom would be overtaken. Amos 9:15 sums up what the restoration would be like by these words stated by the King of the universe. I will plant them on their own soil, no more to be uprooted from their land, which I gave them. Amos 9:7 through 15. Paul would refuse to speak to these, or that the king wills him to visit again, but would take note of their influence. He not only questioned if he will come there peacefully or correct them himself, but also addressed the metropolis about a particular Christian engaging in sins that were taboo from the perspective of the pagans, and that an excommunication be issued against him. Paul hoped that by the metropolis doing so, that the man would repent outside of communion so that his soul could be saved in the end. Transitioning to the arrogant pride of the metropolis, Paul used the Jewish bread-making techniques and Pesach customs as an example of how arrogant pride can fester and poison the faith. On Nisan the 13th, all observant Jewish families look for hummus or yeast and remove it so they can only make unleavened bread and dough from Nisan 15th to the 21st per Exodus 12:21 through 51, 13:17 through 15:26, Leviticus 22:26 through 23:44, and Deuteronomy 15:19 through 16:17. Hummus is also a symbol of arrogant pride. Paul instructed the metropolis to remove the old arrogant pride as Christians through Christ, who is the true and sacrificed paschal lamb, are unleavened in reality. In Jewish bread making, a piece of hummus from one batch of dough is used to ferment other batches of dough. This could increase the risk of food contamination, which shows that arrogant pride can poison a person's faith. Therefore, the Christian should remove all traces of arrogant pride, the yeast of wickedness and evil, for his spiritual health. He must instead mediate and spiritually consume the matzah of purity and truth. Transitioning to the sexual immorality, drunkenness, abusiveness, greed, theft, and idolatry practiced in the metropolis by alleged Christians, Paul instructed devout Christians not to do anything to do with them, or to not have anything to do with them. The metropolis was supported by Deuteronomy 13:6 or verse 5, 17:7, 12, 19:19, 21:21, 22:21, 24, and 24:7, instructed to not judge the sinner by the same standard as the Christian. Expounding on this, Paul instructed that the Christian should bring his complaint against another before the elders and presbyter of his parish instead of the secular court system. As all the redeemed will judge fallen angels, they should be able to judge in matters of the everyday life of the Christian. 1 Corinthians 5, 1 through 13. Paul, initially wanting peace between them and himself, wrote the metropolis 2 letters. He hoped that these 2 letters would aim them in electing the right course of righteous conduct. However, like our Father who has exhausted his patience, knows that he must correct these Christians as a child needs to be corrected. He states that if anyone has harmed them in words, it has been a man in the metropolis whose name is not worth mentioning. As this man has repented, he has not been forgiven, encouraged, or comforted by the bishops or the presbytery. When Paul wrote them, he wanted to test them to see if they would forgive just as easily as they would judge, so they would not be taken advantage of by dark supernatural forces. 2 Corinthians 2, 1 through 11.